So we've looked at, or we're almost going to have looked at, all the first 6 chapters of Ezra, a fast review. What would you say the subject of Ezra 1 through 3 is? How would you summarize it? Okay, the return. How many returns are there? There's 3 of them. Ezra 1 through 3 is what number of return? The first one. And it was, by a large margin, the most amount of people that were going to come back. Over 40,000 of them. The second return is going to be who? Ezra. That's Ezra 7 through 10, which we'll come back to after Ezra. And that was a smaller amount. And then the smallest amount was in the third return, and that was who? Nehemiah. You normally just think, well, apparently it was just Nehemiah who came back. But there were actually several hundred people who came back with Nehemiah, just like we'll see. There were, I think, around 1,500 who came back with Ezra. So, Ezra 1 through 3, that first return. Now, Ezra 4 through 6. What was the summary of it? Because this is kind of what we're winding down talking about. What was Ezra 4 through 6 discussing? The building of the temple, and then in chapter 3 they started building that temple, and then we get to 4, 5, and 6 talks about what? All of the enemies, all of the hindrances that they're going to have, all of the adversaries that they'll have. Now specifically of Ezra 4, 5, and 6, what chapter only really deals with the adversaries? Chapter 4, and then 5, what happens with them? We did just quick overviews, but what happens with them in 5? They start building again. Then in 6, they finish it and they kind of rededicate it. How did they rededicate it? We talked about this last week. How did they rededicate it? Okay, they started back with the sacrifices, and then with what feast? Right, Feast of Passover. So they got back to doing what they were supposed to be doing. Again, the level to which they could do it would have been dramatically different than what they were used to. But, again, there weren't... No one was around, of course, in the heyday of Solomon, because hundreds of years had gone by. But when you think about the amount of what was done to dedicate this temple versus what was done in the amount to dedicate Solomon's temple, it was amazingly different. You go back in 1 Kings chapters 5, 6, and 7, and you see the dedication back then compared to what happened in chapter 6. Radically different. Nevertheless, though, the people were happy. Why? Because they were doing the will of God. And we need to remember that. And this is actually a nice little minor lesson for churches. A nice little minor lesson for churches. A lot of times churches won't be as big as we wish that they could be. But if they're doing the will of God, then we need to what? We need to rejoice in the fact that we can at least identify with some people and actually carry out and do what God wants us to do. Again, we might wish it could be better. We might wish that in some way, some factor of the congregation could be different, could be better, whether you think about it as where the place is located, or the contribution, or the distribution of the crowd, the demographic of the crowd. There's a lot of things in a congregation to kind of pick apart and wish it were better. But never lose sight of the fact that we just need to be thankful and grateful that we have places to actually assemble and to worship and praise and honor God. I've been very, very impressed with some people who who move off. And again, you could talk about the wisdom of the decisions, but they've gone to places, out west where churches are very, very few and far between. And if there's 5 or 10 of them, they feel pretty blessed because of that. There's always someone in worse circumstances, and these people were in some difficult circumstances. And they had adversaries, which leads us to then what we're going to talk about today, which is adversaries of God's people. Now, we brought this up last time. The adversaries, as far as they were concerned, they're going to be present in our life. Who were the adversaries of the Jews? You had them in Zerubbabel's day, Esther's day, Ezra's day, and Nehemiah's day. So in short, how many adversaries did they have? In the time that we're going to study, Ezra, Esther, and Nehemiah, in the time that we're going to study, the Jews never what? They never went without adversaries. They never went without adversaries. It is a very common thing for people to think that no one has it as bad as who? As we do. No one has it as bad as we do. Sometimes that's correct. Sometimes we just don't what? Sometimes we just don't know. We just don't realize what other people had to go through. So the children of Israel always had adversaries, at least in this post-exilic time that we're focusing on. So we brought up the fact that we have adversaries today. Who are the adversaries that we have to deal with today? First of all, unbelievers. In fact, multiple places throughout the Scriptures talk about unbelievers being our adversaries. So what do we do against those adversaries? We try to teach. We try to do what? We try to live a good, righteous life. I didn't mention about the lesson tonight, but the lesson tonight we're going to take from 1 Peter chapter 4. And 1 Peter chapter 4, Peter gives 6 exhortations because he's talking about what I think is going to be the end of the world. I'll discuss that a little bit. But he gives these 6 exhortations, and it's part of the larger theme of 1 Peter, which is Christians are going to suffer. They're going to go through persecution. Because you're going to go through persecution, here's what you need to do. And every one of those things that we'll talk about tonight discuss the fact of actually not just being and doing in the will of God, but serving one another. So that's the response to it, even in the face of unbelievers. Of course, the greatest adversary is the devil. He's pictured this way in multiple places. I brought up the fact, just the name Satan. What does his name Satan mean? Adversary. Adversary. All of the adversaries that we have on earth are all ultimately there because of the adversarial nature of the devil, the adversarial nature of Satan. So, again, we have adversaries today. But let's go on and talk about the idea of adversaries being effective in stopping us. Adversaries being effective in stopping us, because in the effect on the Jews, then the work on the temple ceased for how many years? For how many years? About 15 years. About 15 years. They got back to work and then completed it in about 5 years or so. So, as they began to focus on getting this work done, then we think about the effect that adversaries have on us. It made them stop the work not only for 15 years, but do you remember, and it was Haggai that brought this up, do you remember what the people started doing? They'd stopped work on the temple, and what did they start doing in Haggai? Building their own houses. So they started kind of focusing on what was going on in their personal life. That in a big way is understandable. Okay, why is it understandable? Yes, and when you think about the fact that you feel that something is worthy and then you can't do it, what do people usually do? They do something, they move on to something else. They move on to something else. And it's usually what? It's usually pretty worthy. It's probably down a step, but it's still worthy to do. And this is what the people did. You look in Haggai chapter 1, where he talked about that they had given work to putting up their sealed or their paneled houses. So they were building for themselves very nice homes while the Lord's house lay in ruins. But it was something very understandable. If we can't do what we want to do, we generally switch to something else. So, I'm not excusing them. I'm just saying that if we're in the same situation, we are very likely to just go and shift gears and do something else. So, the same can happen to churches today. When we're not able, or when we find out for whatever reason that the work isn't worthy enough. And probably as far as churches are concerned, what would you feel would be the biggest hindrance in churches doing their work? What makes people want to give up and do something different? What would you think? What would want to make people give up and do something? I don't mean leave completely, but I mean, as we're going to talk about here, just let the work fade. What in your mind would make that happen? Maybe they don't feel edified. What else? A lack of resources, just like in the time that we're talking about. What else? Okay, we might be discouraged because we're doing the effort, but it just doesn't seem what? Like it's doing anything, like it's going anywhere. And then what? Lack of leadership. You know what? What's leadership there to do? Leadership falls into two, and all of you guys who are supervisors or bosses at work, or if you've run your own business, leadership falls into two big categories. So what are those two big categories? Yeah, what are the two big categories of leadership? Right. So leadership involves trying to manage, because you've got employees, you've always got employees that leave, you've got employees that are new, you've got employees that have to step up into higher ranks. In order to move the business forward, you've got to manage people. But then you've also got to make sure that there's direction. So all leadership has got to have both of those directions. If it gets too swallowed up in one or the other, or the worst case scenario, it doesn't do either one of them, then what happens to a church? It'll fall apart. What happens to a business? Probably going to go under. So, look at some of the things that can happen here. The effects that it has on us today. Attendance ceases. Why is that? Why can attendance cease? I talk a lot, I even mentioned it in this lesson, that we need to be devoted people. We need to be devoted people. But, I have to understand that the mirror also has to swing over to me too, in playing a little part of all of this. So, attendance can sometimes cease because what you're giving, and someone else mentioned this earlier, what you're giving doesn't have what to it? Depth, and I think the bigger word is value. So it doesn't have value. So we don't lack a lot of restaurants in Lufkin. We've got plenty of places. So if your place starts to get too expensive, the food takes too long, or the food is too cold, what do? Are you going to give up fast food? Are you going to give up fast food? No, what are you going to do? You're going to go someplace else. Maybe we're not comfortable with this thought, but if the church doesn't provide some kind of value in leading people closer to God, what will people do? Some will give up. Some will give up fast food, undoubtedly. Most do what? They just go somewhere else. So I understand that there is a part that we in leadership play to provide something that's valuable, that's thought-provoking, that challenges people, that tries to motivate people to do better and then provide those opportunities. But the fact is, it's still adversarial in nature. You're constantly fighting against this pull, this drag, or this inertia of the world. And if you're not successful, then attendance is going to begin to cease. And either it ceases completely with some people, not the majority, or else it ceases because people go to some place that they feel is a better value. What else can happen? You've also got growth and work cease. Standing for truth ceases. Personal work ceases. Benevolence ceases. And then, of course, in the end, what happens? The church ceases. And then it's gone. So we've got to think about this. But because all of this, again, in ways plays into the existence of this specific local congregation. Just like it plays into every local congregation. And we have, you'd be kind of surprised. There's not that many Sundays that go by that we don't have visitors. And whether it's a visitor out in the community or more times than not, visitors from other places like we've got this morning, the thing it's still the same. These same truths are going to hold true for you guys just like they hold true for us. The same adversarial nature of the world is either going to let us grow stronger and keep on going, or it ultimately is going to end up in letting us cease. So we don't want to be like that. And we need to understand what this adversarial nature happens, what actually develops with it. But let's talk about another idea. Let's just talk about the idea of different forms. So they came in different forms with association, with intimidation, and with legislation. Now that sounds wonderfully the same, and I like that. But let's break this down. Do you remember in chapter 4, it was last week when we talked about it, association? Do you remember what that meant? In Ezra chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. Here come the adversaries. They said, They wanted to help. Yep, they wanted to help. And what did the Jews say? No. So association. Then in intimidation, what was the response? They wanted to come and, let us come and help you. They said no. So in verses 4 and 5, they actively tried to, sabotage, discourage them. And then when that didn't work, then they bring in what they think is going to be the real thing. And it actually did work for a while. That's our third one here in legislation, and is in Ezra chapter 4 and verse 6. So, real adversaries. Now, what are our adversaries like today? Let's think about this legislation. Do we have Do we have to deal with that problem as an adversary today? Do we have to deal with that problem as an adversary today?
Maybe not from the point where the government is stepping in and trying to stop you from worshiping like some do, but you do have legislation taking place that is against the teachings of the Scripture.
So, as far as the specific things that prohibit us from worshiping, we don't have to worry about it, not here. In fact, in most places in the world, this is kind of surprising. Most places in the world don't really have those kinds of prohibitions. Some people do have to deal with it, and sometimes they're actually pretty severe. We do, though, have to deal with, just like Teresa said, issues that hinder us from actually doing or believing, or at least instill the fear in publicly speaking out and publicly wanting to say what we say against things that are out in the world. I've only halfway kidded about people telling them there's no way that I could run for public office. And you know why? Because there's about 500 videos on our website where I'm saying all different kinds of things that American society is not going to agree with. Or let me put it more specifically, a majority of American society is not going to agree with. So I don't think I'm going to have much of a life in politics. That's just the way that goes. But here were these adversaries now. So what do we deal with? Well, let's suggest some of these adversaries. And they're just as good. They're just as good. Materialism. What is materialism? Yeah, it's just wanting too much of the things of life. Wanting some of the things of life isn't bad. That's really the message of Ecclesiastes. But wanting too much of it is, what does that make you do? That takes your mind off the spiritual. Yeah, takes your mind off the spiritual. When you think about secularism, what is that? What is secularism? So, two broad categories. If it's not spiritual, it's secular. So what does secularism do? And this maybe is kind of what Teresa was saying. Over time, society tends to do what? It tends to get away from God. By removing those different things that make it a spiritual nation. You can look at all different kinds of, just minor political comment, but nations over time become more liberal in their policies. Spending policies, social policies, in every way that you can define policy, nations over time become more liberal. You can look at it forever and ever and ever back in history. It's the way that it goes. Ask me why to explain it. I don't know, but that's just the way that it goes. And there seems to be a tendency that the more liberal it becomes, the more people begin to focus in on themselves. When I was a kid, we would call that humanism. And I kept hearing lesson after lesson after lesson about humanism, because that's secularism. That's taking God and making all of us, making mankind the answer to problems instead of God being the answer to problems. So secularism, that's kind of the frog in the pot of water, if you will. Hedonism. What is hedonism? You don't hear this word much anymore. It's the love of what? The love of what? Well, pleasure. Hedonism is the love of pleasure. Okay? Some pleasures can definitely be, as far as sin is concerned, way out of bounds. But sometimes it's just what? It's It's good old general purpose fun that we what? That you just put, it becomes, if we think about the language that we've been using this morning, it becomes of greater value than something that's spiritual. And so when that begins to happen, if there's nothing that corrects it in your heart, then what you'll see is a slow drift away from the things that are spiritual to looking at the things that are entertaining or that are recreational. And they don't, hedonism has a very, very negative connotation, and it should, because where the word began, it was talking about stuff that was, truly against the will of God. But it didn't have to be. And so when that becomes too much in people's lives, they get away from it. Denominationalism. How is that an adversary? These last two are kind of, in some way, they're kind of opposites of one another. How's denominationalism an adversary? Yes. Absolutely. Right. Good way to put it. What a... You know, you make no mistake. In the New Testament, Jesus identified error, and He was strong against error. Matthew chapter 7, you start in verse 15. These people, these false teachers were like wolves in sheep's clothing. So there were, in no uncertain terms, the New Testament, literally from beginning to end, talks about false doctrine. One of the ways that you could say it, or one of the ways that you could illustrate what denominationalism tries to do, is that if you've got a nice drink, it's going to get hot again this week, it looks like. So if you've got this really nice drink, you've got sweet tea, and it's really good, you've kind of mixed it just right, and then you put it in a glass with a bunch of ice cubes in it, and then you leave that glass for 3 hours. You don't drink it, you just set it there. What happens to the ice? It melts. But what does it do to the taste of the tea? It weakens it. What's the term? It dilutes it. And it's no longer what? It's nowhere near as appetizing as it used to be, because it's been diluted. So denominationalism essentially does what to the true gospel of Christ? It dilutes it. Because at the end of the day, when you come out at the other end of denominationalism, some of it, maybe even arguably, most of it is what? Well, actually, most of it's what? Most of it's true. Most of it, properly defined, is true. But enough of it is significantly wrong that makes it wrong. You've watered down the gospel. Okay, postmodernism. Now let's talk about this one as we close. What's postmodernism? Yes, postmodernism obviously comes on the heels of modernism. Modernism happened in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, where people took belief in the Bible and they tried to deconstruct it by saying that miracles couldn't happen, that miracles didn't have any power. They would try to rationalize and explain away miracles. So we've moved to the next phase, which says we shouldn't worry about the Bible, because in reality there is no what? There is no definitive truth. So postmodernism would say that anything that you hold to be your truth is actually what? Truth. We'll tolerate everyone except the person that comes along and says we shouldn't tolerate it, which is very ironic. Nevertheless, that's what happens. These are adversaries today. These are adversaries that we have to deal with. Okay, let me just give you one more. Adversaries that can be resisted with the right attitude. The attitude of the Jews was the preaching of Haggai and Zechariah. How did God get those people back building the temple? Through the message. Through the message. He didn't send a plague. He didn't kill. He sent it through the message. So how do we get through it today? Well, same way. The preaching of the message. And that message, Philippians chapter 1, verse 28, was a message of no fear. Interestingly, in this context, Paul was talking about in Philippians chapter 1 the fact that he was in prison. And he was willing to continue preaching the gospel. Why? Because he had no fear. And that's the power that the message gave them. Okay, let's get into Esther next time. So please, it's only 10 chapters and not that long of chapters. So go ahead and read that for next time, which will be after our meeting, the book of Esther.